Do you know what it's like for your own daughter, your own flesh and blood, to hand you a bottle of very expensive vodka and say, "Mom, get rid of this," as if I were a trash can? The clatter of silverware fell silent in the old tiled kitchen, and the smell of fresh basil was replaced by a heavy mist. It was supposed to be a regular Sunday lunch, filled with laughter and the cozy embrace of my home in Oxford. But Monica and Robert arrived with a heavy silence. The gesture, so simple and humiliating, was quick. She held out the bottle and whispered those words, her eyes fixed on mine, but not truly seeing me. In that instant, I didn't see my daughter, the girl I cradled in my arms, but a stranger who seemed to be disgusted by me, my house, everything I represented. It wasn't the first time I'd felt Monica's distance, but this time, the pain was physical, like a cold needle in my chest. I tried to find the girl who delighted in my pickled recipes in her eyes, but I only saw an abyss of distrust. The act of treating me like a trash collector, in front of her husband, a man I barely knew, consumed me from within. With every second of silence, the bottle felt heavier in my hands, and the smell of alcohol seemed like a poison she wanted me to swallow. I, Eleanor, the spice artist, who had always tended my garden and my love for my family with the same dedication, stood there, my hands trembling, holding a secret that wasn't mine. Why didn't she leave it in the car? Why the humiliation in my own house? In that instant, I understood that the bottle was just the tip of an iceberg, a pretext for something much bigger, a resentment she had carried for years. Why was her contempt so deep? If my story touches you, stay with me until the end. And if you want to hear real accounts like this, subscribe and share. Maybe the next story will be yours. I woke up early that Sunday, as I always do. The Oxford sun was already shining through the thin curtains in the living room, casting a golden tone over the old tiles of my kitchen. I put the kettle on the stove, and the smell of fresh coffee soon filled the room, mixed with the aroma of the preserves I keep on wooden shelves. At 69, I've learned to value these small rituals. They remind me of my grandmother, who taught me to turn spices into poetry. I spent most of the morning watering the flowers in the garden. The air still carried a damp freshness from the night before, and the sound of sparrows kept me company as I arranged the pots. For a moment, I felt at peace. I knew Monica, my daughter, would be coming with her husband for lunch, and I set the table as I always did. An embroidered tablecloth, earthenware platters, and a stew that let the smell of garlic and bay leaves spread all the way to the street. I remembered when she was little and would run to the kitchen just for the pleasure of stealing a piece of bread before lunch. When they arrived, the sound of the gate opening broke my silence. Monica hurried in, speaking loudly, the heels of her shoes echoing on the old floor. Robert followed close behind, serious, carrying a package. I smiled, but I noticed her eyes didn't meet mine. There was something impatient in the way she dropped her purse on the chair, as if she were just fulfilling a duty. It was then that Monica took a transparent bottle of sophisticated-looking vodka from her bag. She handed me the bottle without ceremony and said, "Mom, please find a way to make this disappear. Robert's dad can't see it." The sentence was said quickly, but with a tone that cut through me like a blade. I stood there, holding the cold glass against my warm hands, not understanding why I should be the one in charge of hiding it. The worst part was the addition, said in a low voice, but loud enough for my son-in-law to hear. "You know, right? He just got out of rehab. If he smells it, it could be a problem. It's better to keep it out of his sight." The way she said it made me feel like I was part of the mess that needed to be hidden. And in that same instant, my stomach turned. I, who had always set the table with so much care, was now being treated like a simple rubbish bin. I looked at Robert, searching for some reaction, but he just adjusted his glasses and looked away. His silence weighed on me even more. His father, sitting in the living room, waited calmly, unaware of the movement. With the bottle in my hands, I felt the strong smell of the alcohol passing through the cork and mixing with the seasoning of my stew. For a second, I thought about obeying, about putting the bottle at the back of the pantry, behind the jars of pickles and jams. But something inside me burned, a silent, contained anger, as if every word of contempt had accumulated for years, just waiting for a push to overflow. It was in that instant that I made my decision. Instead of hiding the bottle, I walked toward the door. The glass was heavy in my hands, and I felt my fingers, damp with sweat. I walked past the living room, under the curious gaze of his father, and held the bottle out directly to him. His expression of surprise was the last image before I heard, behind me, the dry sound of Monica's gasping breath. The silence that followed seemed louder than any scream. Robert's father, a tall man with gray hair and calloused hands, received the bottle with a confused expression, not knowing whether he should smile or refuse. His eyes ran to his son, and then to Monica, as if he were looking for some explanation for that unexpected gesture. The glass shone under the sunlight coming through the door, and I felt my heart pounding in my temples. The bottle weighed more now, even though it was no longer in my hands. "Have you gone mad, Mom?" Monica's voice was filled with anger, shaky and loud enough to echo through the hallway of the house. The smell of the sautéed garlic, which had seemed so welcoming before, now made me sick. I discreetly leaned against the wall, trying to hide the trembling in my legs. Her words hit me with a force that wasn't visible in her gestures. It was as if her hatred had been hidden for years, waiting for the smallest opportunity to reveal itself. Robert closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, like someone trying to avoid a bigger scene. "Monica, calm down," he murmured, almost inaudible, but she ignored him. Her mouth twisted in a mix of crying and indignation, and tears began to fall, smudging the makeup she had so carefully applied. It was a cry of rage, not of pain, and I could tell by the way she clenched her fists and bit her lips. "Why did you do that? You ruined everything," she shouted. And at that moment, his father still held the bottle without understanding, looking now at me, now at his daughter. I didn't answer immediately, because my throat was dry, and every word seemed trapped inside me. I could only hear my own heart, the sound of the pan still on the stove, and the slight creaking of the chair when Robert shifted, uncomfortable. I thought of all the times I had stayed up all night preparing birthday cakes, embroidering tablecloths, and keeping every detail of Monica's childhood in photo albums that I still keep in my bedroom. I thought about how all of that seemed to be worth nothing in the face of the contempt she was displaying at that instant. The room was full of people, but I had never felt so alone. It was as if my own daughter had decided to erase me from her history. "Mom, you never understand anything. Never," Monica repeated, and the phrase hurt me more than any gesture. I didn't know if she was just talking about the bottle or if she was carrying a lifetime of hurt that I was unaware of. Her voice echoed off the cold kitchen tiles, and for an instant I remembered when she was a child and would scream because she didn't want to take a bath or didn't accept no. The difference was that now it wasn't a childish whim. It was an adult accusation, laden with resentment. His father, still embarrassed, placed the bottle on the table like someone returning something he should never have received. He cleared his throat, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and said with a strange calm, "Maybe it's better if I go." Robert tried to hold him by the arm, but the man was already getting up, his gaze heavy with someone who realized he had been the involuntary center of a family conflict that did not belong to him. I stayed there, unable to move. The scene before me looked like a shattered portrait of the family I thought I had built with so much love. The smell of my stew burned slightly, filling the room, but no one cared. The sound of Monica's crying still echoed, and I could only think, what did I do, or failed to do, for my daughter to treat me as if I were invisible, disposable, a burden instead of a support? Robert tried to put out the fire with lukewarm words, but they sounded like drops on a raging bonfire. "Monica, it doesn't have to be like this. It was just a misunderstanding," he said, his voice low, almost apologizing for me. I observed his posture, his shoulders hunched, his gaze fixed on the floor, as if he wanted to disappear. He didn't dare to look at me, let alone at his own father. His silence spoke more than any words. It revealed that he also carried something hidden, perhaps fatigue, perhaps shame. My daughter, however, didn't want to listen. She turned to me, her eyes watery, and snapped, "You always do this. Mom, you always have to ruin everything. You always have to get involved where you're not wanted." With every word, I felt as if I was being pushed against the kitchen wall, the cold tiles chilling my back. I was still holding a dish towel in my hands, and I realized the fabric was damp. I don't know if it was from sweat or from the tears that had escaped without me noticing. I tried to answer. but my voice came out choked, almost a whisper. I just didn't understand why you needed to hide it. You could have left it in the car. It wasn't my place. The sentence died before it finished, swallowed by Monica's crying. She threw her head back, as if my explanation were irrelevant, and wiped her hand hard across her face, smudging her makeup even more. The sound of her ragged breathing filled the room, mixing with the crackle of the oil in the pan. His father, embarrassed, took a few steps toward the door, but Robert ran to hold him. "Dad, don't go now, please," he asked, his voice low and shaky. The man shook his head, his gaze heavy, and replied, "I shouldn't be here. This isn't about me." And yet, his presence was the center of everything. My heart tightened as I wondered, if it wasn't about him, then what was it about? What was actually behind Monica's anger? I turned my eyes to my daughter, and I saw something in her that I had never seen before: contempt. It wasn't just passing irritation. It was an anger that seemed to have accumulated for years, silent, fermenting like wine forgotten in the dark. "You don't understand anything, Mom. You never have. Always with this habit of wanting to be the good person, the one who solves everything, but no one asked for your help." These words were said almost spat, and each one entered me like splinters. In that instant, a memory flashed through me. I saw her as a child, in the garden of our old house, crying because she had lost a doll. I remember leaving my sewing to go out into the street, looking until I found the toy and gave it back to her. The smile I received that day was one of the greatest rewards of my life, and now, in front of that adult woman who was spitting words of hatred, I wondered where that connection had been lost. I could hear my own heart beating in my ears, muffling some of the sounds around me. The kitchen smelled of burned food, the steam rose heavily, and I no longer knew if I was sweating from the heat or from nerves. My knees were weakening, but I stood firm, because if I fell in front of them, the humiliation would be complete. I looked at the set table, the plates I had arranged with so much care, and I wondered if anyone there would sit down to eat after that. In that instant, I realized that the bottle wasn't just a bottle. It was a symbol. Monica's pretext had been the alcohol, Robert's father, the rehab. But the real violence wasn't there. It was in the way she put me in the role of someone who had no value, of someone who could be used to hide, to disappear, to not exist. The cold glass I handed to his father was just the spark. The flame came from a long time ago, and I knew that from then on, I could no longer pretend I didn't see it. Monica's crying turned into lower sobs, but each one seemed laden with hatred. She moved a few steps away from me, crossed her arms, and started walking back and forth in the living room, her heels tapping on the wooden floor like hammer blows. I followed her with my eyes, trying to find a trace of the girl, who once ran barefoot in the yard asking for guava juice in those hard features. But what I saw now was a stranger, a woman consumed by something I still didn't understand. "You've always been like this, Mom. You've always thought you knew what was best, but it was never enough." Her voice came out almost in a whisper, but it was laden with poison. Robert tried to intervene, lightly touching her arm, but she dodged him. The gesture was quick, like someone rejecting not only the touch, but everyone's presence. The silence that followed was broken by the sound of the wind beating on the front door, making the old hinges creak. I tried to defend myself, but my words came out weak. "Monica, I just wanted to." I couldn't finish. The feeling was that any justification would be useless in the face of the wall of resentment she had built against me. The smell of burnt food intensified, and I noticed the pan releasing smoke from the side of the lid. The lunch I had prepared with so much care was turning to ashes, just like the relationship between us. Robert's father, already by the door, cleared his throat and said in a dry tone, "I don't want to be the reason for all this. I'll wait outside." And he left, closing the door behind him. The click of the latch echoed like the end of a chapter, leaving just the three of us there, trapped in a space too small for so much resentment. I took a deep breath, but the air felt heavy, loaded with accusations that hung even without being spoken. Monica turned to me again, her face red, her eyes still watery. "You made me feel embarrassed in front of everyone. Don't you see? You always put me in this ridiculous position." Her words were like stones. I stood motionless, remembering the countless times I had defended her in conversations with neighbors, teachers, even family, always trying to protect her from judgment. And now it was her who was accusing me of exposing her to ridicule. Robert took a deep breath, ran his hands through his hair, and spoke with a thread of a voice. "Monica, maybe your mother didn't mean it. It was a different gesture, but not one of malice." I noticed his careful choice of words, as if he was choosing every syllable so as not to inflame the fire even more. But Monica interrupted him immediately. "Shut up, Robert. You don't understand." The way she said it not only silenced him, but revealed that there was much more stored there, a weight that didn't just concern that bottle. That phrase cut through me. "You don't understand." I myself didn't understand. What had I done that was so serious to deserve that look full of resentment? My mind began to search for memories. A childhood where maybe I was too strict, some choice she considered unfair. I found myself replaying fragments of an entire life, but none of them seemed to justify such hostility. The sound of the wood crackling in the stove seemed to accompany the turmoil inside my head. I stayed silent, and that silence was stronger than any response. I just looked at my daughter, trying to find an opening in her, a point of tenderness. But all I got back was a cold, hard look, as if I were a stranger sitting at the table. At that moment, I realized that the bottle had not been the trigger for a simple fight, but the key that opened the door to something much deeper, an abyss between the two of us that I no longer knew how to cross. I wanted to speak, but my throat seemed to be stuck, as if an invisible knot prevented me from uttering any word. The smell of burnt food was already taking over the kitchen, and the damp steam stuck to my skin. I walked to the stove and turned off the heat, but I didn't have the courage to lift the pan lid. It seemed too symbolic, as if facing what was inside was facing the ruin of lunch and our relationship. My hands trembled as I held the pan handle, and I realized that even my knees were weakening. The house that had always been my refuge now seemed like a strange, hostile place. Monica pulled a chair and sat down with a loud bang, the sound echoing on the wooden floor. "You never knew how to listen to me, Mom. Never." The phrase was cutting, and I felt my heart race, as if I were facing a painful revelation. I looked at her carefully, trying to understand what she really meant. The tone of her voice was not just anger. There was also pain, an old hurt that she had perhaps carried alone for years. Robert, still standing, ran his hand over the back of his neck and let out a heavy sigh. "Maybe it's time for you to explain, Monica, because the way it is, no one understands anything." He spoke softly, but every word seemed to ignite her fury even more. "It's not your business, Robert. It's between me and her." The explosion came quickly, and for an instant I felt that my daughter was not only fighting with me, but against something inside herself, as if there was a poorly healed wound that bled whenever my name came up. I took a deep breath and, unable to contain myself, asked, "What did I do? Where did I go wrong with you?" My voice came out choked, filled with anguish, but firm enough to cut through the sound of her ragged breathing. Monica raised her face and looked at me, her eyes red and full of tears, but without any tenderness. "You always wanted to be the perfect mother, but you never were. Always worried about what other people thought. But with me, you never really cared." Her words hit me like punches to the chest. I almost lost my breath. What did she mean? I never cared. My whole life had been dedicated to her. The embroidered trousseau, the nights I stayed up late preparing lunchboxes so she would have food, the advice that might have sounded strict, but was always the result of my fear of seeing her suffer. I wanted to retort. I wanted to throw back every memory of sacrifice, but my body seemed paralyzed. And at the same time, a part of me began to doubt. Could she, in some way, be right? The silence that followed was interrupted only by the distant sound of a car passing on the street. Outside, life went on as normal. Children played, dogs barked, the wind rustled the leaves of the mango tree in the backyard. Inside, everything seemed suspended in the air, as if each of us was afraid to take the next step. I looked at Monica and felt the weight of decades of distance, of a barrier that I had never noticed growing between us. "Do you think cooking and setting the table is enough to be a mother?" She spat the question with disdain, and my chest burned. I, who had always seen food as the greatest gesture of love I could offer, was now hearing from my daughter's mouth that this gesture had never been enough. My vision blurred for an instant, and the dish towel in my hands was already soaked with tears. At that moment, I had a painful certainty. The vodka bottle wasn't the problem. It was just the excuse, the trigger. What was crushing me was what came from behind, this open abyss, between me and my daughter, an abyss that may not have been born that Sunday, but that had been growing silently for years, without me having noticed. And now, with her every word, I understood that nothing would be the same after that day. I sat down slowly on the edge of the table, as if my legs were no longer able to support the weight of my body. The smell of smoke still coming from the pan seemed to mix with the metallic smell of the tears that ran down the corner of my mouth. I looked at the still empty plates, each piece of cutlery carefully aligned, and I felt as if all that preparation was a play that had lost its meaning before it even began. The table, which had so often symbolized union, was now just the setting for an invisible battle that I didn't know how to win. Monica didn't stop nervously moving her fingers against the table, as if playing a silent melody of resentment. "You know what else annoyed me when I was a teenager, Mom?" she said suddenly, without looking at me. "You would always show up with your preserves and spices, as if that would solve any problem. I would cry, I would scream, and you would come with a pretty plate, as if food were the answer to everything." Her voice was hard, but the tremor betrayed that the memory still hurt her. Her words pierced me in an unexpected way. I had always believed that my form of love was valid, that cooking was the most genuine way to care. But now, hearing her spit that out as an accusation, I began to wonder if, instead of comfort, my gestures were seen as an escape. My heart tightened and a suffocating regret took over me. What if, all those times, I should have stayed silent, just listened, instead of filling her mouth with food? Robert, restless, pulled a chair and sat down too, trying to bring some balance to the room. "Monica, that's not fair. I see how much your mom dedicates herself. She always talks about you with pride." He said this looking at me, as if he wanted to give me back some dignity. But Monica scoffed, running her hands across her face, and replied with an acidic tone, "You don't know anything about what I lived through in here. Nothing." His silence was immediate, and I realized that, even with good intentions, his words would not be able to cross the wall that existed between the two of us. My hands sought support on the tablecloth, and I felt the embroidered texture, every stitch I had made with patience over the years. That was a living memory of lonely nights. When I embroidered, thinking of Monica as an adult, imagining her happy, receiving friends, being treated with respect. And now, the tablecloth was between us like a border that it was no use embroidering anymore. With every tear that dripped onto it, I felt as if the very memory of the love I had put into every stitch was falling apart. "You never asked me what I really wanted, Mom. You always decided for me. You always thought you knew better." She said this with a chilling calmness, and this calmness hurt more than the previous screams. It was as if, all of a sudden, anger had given way to a coldness that totally excluded me from the space. I remembered the times I said no to some of her friendships, or when I convinced her to study at a more rigid school, believing I was protecting her. I had done it out of love, but what if she only saw it as control? Memories overwhelmed me with force. I saw myself, years ago, saving every penny to buy the best books for her. I remembered when I refused to buy expensive clothes for myself, just to make sure she had a nice dress for the school dance. I never thought these gestures could be read as imposition, as suffocation. My vision blurred, and the only thing I could stammer was, "I never wanted to hurt you. Never." My voice came out low, broken, but true. Monica looked at me with hard eyes, and for an instant I saw in them a mix of pain and defiance. "Well, you did hurt me, and now it's too late." The silence that followed was unbearable. I could only hear the ticking of the wall clock, a constant sound that reminded me that time was passing, that every second was one more brick in the distance that was building up between us. And at the same time, I knew that that conversation had not yet reached its core. There were more things buried that would come to light, and I needed to be ready to listen, even if every word was a blow. The wall clock seemed to mock me with its relentless ticking. I didn't know if time was passing fast or slow. Every second was an eternity. Monica remained seated, her arms crossed, and she didn't take her eyes off me. Her gaze was hard, but there was something hidden there, a shadow of sadness that she didn't let show completely. The smell of smoke permeated every corner of the house, clinging to our clothes and skin, as if the very memory of that day were impossible to erase. Robert cleared his throat, uncomfortable, and said, "Maybe we should stop here. Everyone is getting upset." His attempt to put an end to it sounded fragile, almost childish. Monica, without even turning her head, responded with sarcasm. "Of course it's easy for you to say that, isn't it? You never lived with her." That phrase fell into the room like a stone thrown into still water, creating silent waves that hit us in different ways. I felt my stomach clench. Robert lowered his eyes and went silent. The pain in Monica's words was not just in the content, but in the way she spat them out, as if she had finally found space to pour out years of resentment. I wanted to answer. I wanted to explain that yes, maybe I had made mistakes, but that everything was out of love. However, I realized that this word, love, had turned into something harsh between us, something that no longer carried the same meaning. What was love to me seemed to have been a prison for her. "You always wanted to control everything," she continued, now in a lower but firm voice. "Even my happiness, even my mistakes. You couldn't just let me live." The words echoed inside me like muffled thunder. I listened to her and remembered every decision made in her place. The course I suggested, the advice I forced, the friendships I advised against. At the time, it all just seemed like care. But could it have been suffocation for her? I closed my eyes for an instant and felt my face hot, as if it were burning with a fever. The dish towel in my hands was already completely soaked, but I kept wringing it as if it were the only way to hold on to my nerves. The sound of the mango tree leaves hitting the wall outside seemed distant, and reality was reduced to that confrontation inside the house. I knew there was no going back. Monica was opening a wound that might never heal. "And you know what hurts the most?" she said, leaning forward, bringing her face closer to mine. "You never admitted anything. You always pretended that everything was fine, that we were the perfect family. And I grew up, swallowing that, swallowing the silence, swallowing your food as if it were medicine, and it never was." Tears ran down her face, but her voice didn't tremble. It was a sentence, a verdict. I felt a grip so strong on my chest that I had to hold on to the edge of the table to keep from falling. Robert tried to intervene again. "Monica, please calm down. You need to talk, not destroy each other." But she raised her hand in the air, telling him to be quiet, and he obeyed. I watched that gesture and realized that he was also a victim of something, perhaps the same anger that was now directed at me. His silence was that of someone who had tried before, without success, of someone who had learned that fighting her fury was useless. I took a deep breath and decided to speak, even if my voice came out weak. "I may have made mistakes, yes, maybe many times, but I never stopped loving you, Monica. Never." My words were simple, but I said them with all the weight of my soul. Monica laughed. Short and bitter laugh, as if hearing that was just more proof that I didn't understand anything. That sound echoed through the room like a laugh of defeat, and I felt that something inside me was breaking into pieces too small to be rebuilt. Monica's bitter laugh hurt me more than any words. It was quick, but cutting, as if it had reduced me to nothing. I shrank in the chair, trying not to fall apart in front of her. The air seemed thin inside the kitchen. Every breath was an effort. The smell of my burnt stew already permeated the house, mixed with the overly sweet perfume my daughter wore. That mixture of aromas was etched into me as a memory of a moment when everything turned to ashes, even in the face of the colors I had always tried to give to life. She continued, now with her eyes fixed on mine. "You talk about love, but what you call love has always been an obligation, Mom. You did it because you had to, because you had nothing else, never because you really wanted to listen to me, to understand me." The coldness of those words left me paralyzed. I thought of all the days I cooked with pleasure, when I waited for her visit with joy, when I watered the flowers in the backyard, thinking of making the house beautiful to receive her. For me, all of this was love, but from her mouth, it turned into an accusation. Robert, motionless beside me, seemed crushed by the situation. He fidgeted with his fingers, tapping them lightly on the table, like someone counting the seconds, until silence returned. When he finally spoke, his voice was cautious. "Monica, that's not fair. I've already seen how much your mother gives. Maybe you two just speak different languages." But she interrupted him without looking at him, the anger so concentrated on me. that no one else seemed to matter. Different languages? No, she just never wanted to learn mine. I felt the ground sway beneath my feet. The accusation was simple, but devastating. I remembered the times I tried to get closer, the conversations I thought we had, the small victories I thought I had shared with her. Was all of that an illusion? Could my daughter, in silence, feel lonely even by my side? I asked myself, almost without a voice, did I fail at everything? And that question was stuck in my chest like a stone. Monica's anger seemed to grow as I fell silent. She got up from the chair and started walking in circles, her hard steps echoing on the floor. I didn't need food, Mom. I needed you, truly present. Not this image of a perfect housewife, of a woman who only knew how to please the neighbors and show off the model family. The tone of her voice broke in that last sentence, and for the first time, I saw not only anger, but pure pain, as if she had been keeping that wound silent for decades. I wanted to get up to hug her, but my body didn't respond. The fear of being rejected once again froze me in the chair. I just clutched the dish towel to my chest, trying to contain the trembling. Memories came like a flood. Her and me together at the market, choosing fruits, me teaching her how to cut vegetables, me singing softly to make her fall asleep. And now, all those memories seemed to be worth nothing to her. Every gesture that I considered love, she called an obligation or an act. Robert also got up, perhaps in an attempt to put an end to it. Monica, enough. You're hurting your mother more than you've been hurt your whole life. His voice was firm this time, and I realized that he couldn't stand to watch that scene anymore. But Monica turned to him with eyes flashing. And you think she hasn't hurt me my whole life? You don't know what it's like to live like this. He backed away, silent, and I realized that no possible defense would come from outside. This war was only between the two of us. I finally took a deep breath and spoke. My voice choked but clear. If I made mistakes, it was while trying to do the right thing. I didn't know how to do it differently. I didn't learn to be a mother in another way. I did it with what I had, with what I knew. The words came out slowly, heavily, but they were all I could offer. Monica closed her eyes, and a single tear ran down her face. But when she opened them again, her gaze was still full of hurt. The silence that followed was so deep that even the clock seemed to stop. The tear that ran down Monica's face seemed to contradict her own words, as if there was a battle inside her between anger and a fragility she refused to admit. I looked at her with a heavy heart, not knowing if it was the time to insist on a gesture of approach, or if silence would be less cruel. My hands were sweating, and I felt the dish towel slip between my fingers. The smell of food no longer came from the stove. It came from the burnt crust stuck to the bottom of the pan, spreading a bitter aroma that seemed to translate exactly what was happening between us. Monica pulled a chair again, sitting down with a loud thud. She took a deep breath and said, "You will never understand. For you, everything has always been for show. The Sunday lunch, the impeccable house, the embroidered tablecloth, all for others to see. But me, I was in the background." The hardness of her voice hurt me more than any object could. I, who had spent years believing that every detail was an act of care, was now hearing from my daughter's mouth that those same details were marks of absence. I tried to answer, but the words got tangled in my throat. I looked at the tablecloth embroidered with my own hands, and saw in it every dawn I had stayed awake, sewing stitch by stitch, believing I was building happy memories. Monica, I thought this was love. I thought that was how you showed love. My voice failed, and I saw her expression twist, as if she were unable to accept or reject at the same time. Robert, silent until then, rose again, with an unexpected firmness. "Monica, enough. You are hurting your mother more than you have been hurt your whole life. I know you have grudges, but you can't throw everything away like this." He spoke softly, but firmly, and for the first time I saw in his eyes a mixture of courage and despair. Monica turned slowly to him, and the silence that hung was so heavy that the sound of the birds outside seemed too distant, almost unreal. "You don't know anything, Robert. Nothing." Her phrase was spat out like poison, but what caught my attention was that her voice choked at the end. There was pain there, a pain that she seemed to hide from everyone. I realized in that instant that the conflict was not just with me, it was with herself. She was at war with her own history, and I was the mirror that made her face everything she tried to hide. The weight of that perception made me dizzy, as if the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. I leaned on the table to keep from falling. The cold of the wooden top against my hands was the only contact with reality. I wanted to get up and hug her, but the fear of rejection was still greater. So, I risked a simple question, almost whispered, "What can I do now to change this?" My voice came out so low that I thought she wouldn't hear, but Monica slowly raised her head, and her fixed gaze made me tremble. "Now? Now it's too late. You had a whole lifetime to ask that." The sentence fell on me like a stone. My breath failed, and I felt tears run uncontrollably. My chest burned as if it were on fire, and for the first time I realized that there was no ready answer, no culinary gesture or embroidery that could stitch the tear that existed between us. I just stood there, motionless, looking at my daughter like someone looking at a stranger who talks about a past I can't recognize. The silence returned to dominate the room. Robert looked from one to the other, without the courage to interfere again. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, and a shadow was entering through the window, leaving the kitchen in a dim light that seemed to further increase the weight of that conversation. I knew that something had to happen. A decision had to be made, because if I let the night fall without reacting, I might never have another chance to reach my daughter. The dim light that was taking over the kitchen seemed to reflect the state of my heart. Dark, confused, suffocated. I looked at Monica and realized that there were no more masks, no more of the veneer of polite Sunday conversations. What remained was raw. It was exposed pain. It was a naked resentment. I wondered if, at some point, I would have the courage to open that wound alone, or if I needed that bottle of vodka, that absurd trigger, for the truth to finally come to light. Robert's silence was heavy, but what truly crushed me was the certainty that nothing would ever be the same. I decided to break the silence in an unexpected way. "Then tell me, Monica, what did you want from me? What could I have done?" My voice came out firm, though choked. It wasn't a provocation, it was a desperate plea for clarity. She looked back at me, her eyes swollen, and took a deep breath before answering. "I wanted you to have listened to me, Mom. That's all. That you had looked at me without trying to fix anything, without trying to turn me into what you thought was right. I just wanted to be myself, and you never let me." Those words echoed inside me like a death sentence. I remembered so many occasions when I interrupted her with ready advice, when I criticized choices that seemed risky to me, when I tried to steer her life towards safer paths. I always thought I was protecting her, but maybe I was just pruning her. The image of her as a teenager, locked in her room with loud music, came back to my memory. Maybe that rebellious silence was already a scream that I refused to hear. "You always wanted me to be the perfect daughter, and I tried, Mom. I swear I tried. But every time I failed, it was as if you looked at me with disappointment, and I could never forgive myself for that." Monica said this with tears running freely, her makeup smudged without her caring anymore. The hardness of her voice had given way to a vulnerability that, for an instant, made me forget the anger. I saw the girl who once sought approval in my eyes, and not the woman who now spat accusations. My chest hurt as if it were being torn from within. I wanted to shout that I never saw her as a failure, that I had always been proud, even in the moments when she got lost. But the words got stuck in my throat, and the only thing I could do was extend my hand over the table, a timid, uncertain gesture. "Monica, I'm sorry if I didn't know how to listen to you. I thought I was taking care of you. I thought that's what mothers did." My hand was trembling, and the space between us seemed like an abyss impossible to cross. She looked at my outstretched hand and hesitated. The hard look was still there, but there was also a pain so great that it seemed to be begging for rest. Time froze in that instant. I didn't know if she would accept it, push it away, or simply leave me hanging. Every second was an eternity. The smell of alcohol that escaped from the bottle on the table hit me, and I couldn't help but think that that transparent glass had brought to light everything that had been stored away for years. Robert, for the first time in a long time, approached Monica and placed his hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to carry this alone, but you also don't have to hurt those who love you." His voice was calm, firm, and even though she had pushed him away before, this time she didn't interrupt him. She just lowered her eyes, took a deep breath, and stood there in silence. I took advantage of that moment to keep my hand outstretched, without haste, without pressure, just open. like a bridge I didn't know if she would cross. The clock returned to mark its presence with its insistent ticking. I wondered if that would be the moment when something would change, or if it was just another frustration to be stored away. The air in the kitchen was heavy, dense, as if it were difficult to breathe. Outside, the sun was already almost hiding behind the rooftops of Oxford, and the shadow was invading the house completely. I knew the night would bring silence, but I didn't know if it would bring peace. Everything depended on what my daughter would do with that gesture that I, even broken, still had the courage to offer. Monica looked at my outstretched hand for a few seconds that seemed like an eternity. Her gaze wavered, as if there was a struggle within her between accepting and rejecting that gesture. I didn't move. I just left my hand there, open, vulnerable. The silence was so heavy that even the distant sound of a dog barking in the street seemed to invade the kitchen. Then, she took a deep breath, shook her head, and said softly, "I don't know if I can, Mom." It was like taking another blow. Not a complete refusal, but the realization that the wound was still too open to be touched. I slowly pulled back, closing my hand on my lap. The weight of the unrequited gesture made me feel smaller, as if my body had shrunk a few inches. The dish towel slipped from my lap and fell to the floor, spreading the stains of tears and grease on the cold floor. That detail struck me in a strange way. It seemed symbolic. Everything I had offered, all the care, was now there, dirty, forgotten on the floor, with no one caring. Robert tried to break the tension, his voice sounding firmer than before. "You two need to find a way. This silence will destroy you." He seemed to be begging for a truce, but Monica turned to him with a look that silenced him again. It wasn't just anger. It was the expression of someone carrying a burden so great that they couldn't share it. I realized, in that instant, that maybe it wasn't just with me. Maybe she was fighting an internal battle that always overflowed in my direction, because I was the easiest target, the closest one. I felt a sudden dizziness, and leaned my hand on the table to keep from falling. The heat that came from the already turned-off stove mixed with the cold of the floor, creating a strange contrast in the room. My body seemed to react to the weight of everything that was being said. I wondered if I should insist, if I should dig deeper into that pain, or if the best thing would be to let silence occupy the space. The fear of losing my daughter completely made me want to speak, but the fear of causing more pain held me to the chair. "I didn't want to be here today," Monica said suddenly, her voice almost a whisper. "If it weren't for Robert, I wouldn't have even come." These words cut me like glass. It was as if my presence was not only dispensable, but unwanted. My heart tightened in a way that reminded me of the night my husband passed away, when I felt that the world had lost the ground beneath my feet. Only now the pain was different. It didn't come from death, but from the rejection of someone who was still alive, of someone I myself had brought into the world. I couldn't hold back the tears this time. I cried in silence, with my face turned to the side, because I didn't want her to see my weakness. But the sound of my sobs escaped, and the silence in the room was completely broken. Robert closed his eyes, as if he couldn't stand to watch, and Monica looked away, perhaps because she couldn't bear the scene she herself had caused. The bitter smell of burnt food continued to permeate the air, reminding all of us that lunch had ended before it even began. I gathered my strength and said in a hoarse voice, "If my presence hurts you so much, Monica, maybe it's better for me to back off. Maybe that's what you want." Saying that was like tearing a piece out of me. My daughter looked at me again, her eyes watery, but still hard. She didn't answer immediately. She just took a deep breath and ran her hands through her hair, as if she wanted to organize thoughts that had been in disorder for years. Finally, she murmured, "I don't know what I want. I just know I'm tired of feeling small near you." This phrase echoed in the kitchen like a shot. Small. I never wanted her to feel that way. Never. But in that instant, I realized that, despite my intentions, that had been her truth for a whole lifetime, and nothing I said now would erase that. The word small wouldn't leave my head. I looked at her, and saw not just the woman in front of me, but the girl who once hid behind my skirts, afraid of thunder. How did that child, so full of dreams, turn into this adult, marked by hurts I didn't even know existed? I felt as if I had failed to decipher my own daughter. as if we had lived in different houses, even under the same roof. My chest was burning, and my breathing was short, as if the air was no longer enough. "I never wanted you to feel that way," I said. My voice choked. "Maybe I was wrong in trying to protect you too much, but my love was never meant to belittle you." Monica looked at me with red eyes, and for a moment she seemed to hesitate, but she soon shook her head, as if she couldn't accept my words. "You might even believe that, Mom, but what I lived was different. You can call it care. I call it a prison." Every syllable of hers fell on me like a brick, building an even higher wall between us. Robert sighed deeply and rubbed his hands on his face. "You two need to stop turning this into a war. Maybe it's time to look forward, not back." He seemed exhausted, and I knew that conversation was also affecting him, even in a different way. But Monica didn't let his phrase echo for long. "Look forward? How, Robert? How can I look forward when the person who was supposed to love me more than anything was the same one who suffocated me the most?" Her voice was a mixture of anger and despair, and I realized that she was also on the verge of a breakdown. My mind traveled back to so many moments I considered victories. Her diploma, her first job, her marriage. In each of those days, I remember feeling proud. But what if, behind the smiles that I keep in photos, she was already carrying this burden? What if those smiles were just for others to see, while inside she was screaming for freedom? This possibility crushed me. If it were true, I not only failed as a mother, but I was also blind to the pain of the person I loved the most. I tried to gather the courage to say something more, but my words were lost in the crying that I couldn't hold back. The tears fell on the embroidered tablecloth, staining the threads I had patiently sewn myself. The sight of those stains brought me a terrible sense of powerlessness. Not even the firmest embroidery can withstand the weight of water, and not even the most dedicated relationship can withstand the weight of stored-up hurts. I was in front of living proof of this. Monica, for the first time, didn't interrupt me. She just watched me, serious, as I cried. There was a hardness in her gaze, but also something that seemed to waver, as if part of her sympathized with the scene. I didn't know if that silence was a sign that she was digesting my words, or if it was just another barrier. But the fact that she didn't cut me off was, in a way, a change in the tone of that afternoon. The sun outside had almost completely disappeared, and the kitchen was plunged into a bluish, dim light. The lamp above the table cast a weak light, leaving marked shadows on all our faces. I felt like I was inside an old portrait, a frozen image of a moment that would never be forgotten. My heart was pounding, and I realized that we were reaching a point of no return. We would either find a bridge there, or we would dig a definitive abyss. It was then that I decided to get up. My legs were still trembling, but I leaned on the table and stood up. "Monica," I said, looking directly into her eyes, "if you feel that I made you small, tell me now what I can do so that, at least from now on, you feel big. I can't change the past, but I can change what still exists of me in the present." My words came out as a final appeal, filled with pain, but also with hope. The silence that followed was absolute, and I knew that her answer would define much more than that night. Monica stared at me in silence for a few seconds that felt like an eternity. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. She seemed to be fighting against herself. "What do I want?" she repeated, her voice trembling. "I want you to stop pretending that nothing happened. I want you, at least once in your life, to say out loud that you were wrong, that you weren't this perfect mother that everyone thinks you are. I want you to admit that you failed me." Her words were like a direct punch to the stomach. I was breathless, but I knew I had to answer. I took a deep breath, held the back of the chair to keep from faltering, and said, "I was wrong, Monica. I was very wrong. I thought I was protecting you, but I ended up suffocating you. I thought I was showing love, but maybe I was just imposing it. I failed, yes, and it hurts more than anything to admit this, but I failed you." My words came out with difficulty, but also with a sincerity I had never put into words before. I felt a weight lift from my chest, even though tears continued to run down my face. Monica closed her eyes for an instant and let out a sob. It was quick, but true. When she opened her eyes, they were different. Still watery, but less hard. "You've never said that before," she murmured. "You always pretended that everything was fine, that we were a happy family." I slowly shook my head, because I was afraid. afraid to admit that I could lose you if I acknowledged my mistakes. And ironically, maybe that's what ended up pushing us apart. Sincerity hurt me, but at the same time it seemed to open a door that had always been locked. Robert remained silent, but I saw him take a deep breath, as if there was finally a breath of fresh air in that suffocating environment. His gaze softened, and I realized that even he seemed relieved to hear that. It was as if all of us had been waiting for that confession for years, but no one had the courage to bring it out. I felt that, in some way, admitting the failure was less painful than continuing to carry the mask of the perfect mother. Monica rested her elbows on the table, covering her face with her hands. Her breathing was heavy, as if she were trying to expel something trapped inside her. I just wanted you to have looked at me for real, Mom. Not as someone to mold, but as someone to love the way she was. That phrase pierced my heart. I extended my hand again, hesitantly, and this time she didn't push it away. She still didn't hold it, but she didn't push it away. And that, for me, was already a first sign. I felt I was facing a choice. I could insist on defending myself, justifying every decision, or I could finally be quiet and listen to her, as she had always wanted. So I remained still, just present, letting her fill the silence. The whole house seemed to wait for her words. Even the wind outside stopped, and the only sound was the clock ticking the seconds that were separating or uniting us. You don't know how many times I felt lonely, even living with you. How many times I wanted to talk, but you were busy with your recipes, with your spices, with the visitors. I felt invisible in my own house. Her words shattered me. The craft I loved, which I had always considered my refuge and my legacy, now emerged as proof of my absence. I never imagined that my preserves, my jams, my spices, could be remembered as rivals instead of comfort. With her every phrase, I felt more and more stripped, more exposed. But at the same time, I realized that there was the key, to listen to the end, without defending myself. If I wanted any chance of rebuilding anything with my daughter, I needed to endure that pain. So, I just nodded my head, tears running down my face, and whispered, "I am listening to you, Monica," for the first time, for real. The silence that followed was not one of resentment. It was of something that was beginning to transform. The words, "I am listening to you," hung in the air, as if the house itself had absorbed them. Monica slowly took her hands away from her face and looked at me. The hard glint in her eyes had given way to something more complex, a mixture of exhaustion, pain, and perhaps relief. "I've been waiting a long time for this, Mom," she said, in a low, almost broken tone. I thought I would never hear it. It was in that instant that I realized that my silence of so many years had been more cruel than any scolding or advice. Not saying anything, not acknowledging anything, made her feel that her pain never existed for me. The memory of nights when I saw her crying in her room, and instead of going in, I decided to leave a plate of food at the door, hit me like an arrow. I thought I was respecting her space, but maybe I was just confirming her loneliness. I should have knocked on that door, I confessed, my voice hoarse. I should have gone in and listened to you, but I was afraid of saying the wrong thing, afraid of making it worse. So I hid behind the pans, the spices. Now I see that was cowardice. My words were not justifications. They were a confession. Monica didn't answer immediately. She stood there, watching me, and I saw her mouth tremble before she let out a long sigh. "Maybe I was also wrong," she murmured, looking down. I could have spoken before, but I let it all accumulate. And when I realized it, it was already hatred. That admission was like a fissure in the wall that was between us. For the first time, I felt that I wasn't the only one carrying guilt, but that there was space for a mutual acknowledgement. Robert closed his eyes for a moment, and I realized that he was also emotional. His hands were intertwined on the table, and the relief in his expression was evident. "You don't know how long I've been waiting to see this moment," he said in a low voice, almost to himself. The kitchen, once taken over by the smell of burning and the weight of anger, now seemed lighter, as if the air had started to circulate again. There was still pain, but it was no longer suffocating. It was a pain that pointed to the possibility of healing. Monica reached out, hesitantly, until she touched the edge of the embroidered tablecloth I had, made. She ran her fingers over the stitches, almost as if she were remembering something. I felt my heart race, without the courage to move. Then, she looked up and said, "I hated this tablecloth. I thought it was tacky, heavy. But now, looking at it, I realize it was the way you found to be present, even when I didn't want you to be. I had never thought of it that way." Her voice was choked, and I saw that the ice was beginning to melt. I couldn't take it anymore. I extended my hand again, and this time she didn't hesitate. Our fingers met on the tablecloth, and the texture of the embroidery became a witness to a gesture that seemed simple, but carried decades of silence. My tears ran freely, and I didn't try to hide them. "I don't want you to feel small anymore," I said softly. "If I have to, I'll undo every stitch on this tablecloth, every preserve in this kitchen, just so you feel big beside me." Monica squeezed my hand, still crying, but now without resistance. "I don't want you to undo anything, Mom. I just need you to be here, whole, without hiding." Her words entered me like a promise, a path to follow. I nodded my head, unable to speak, because crying prevented me. The touch of her hand was fragile, but real, and that was more than I could ask for at that moment. The clock was ticking almost 7 in the evening. The smell of burning still permeated the house, but, curiously, it no longer seemed unbearable. Maybe because, in the middle of the bitterness, something new had been born. "I know I will make mistakes again, Monica," I confessed, "because there is no such thing as a perfect mother. But if you give me the chance, I want to learn to be the mother you need, and not the one I imagined." It was the first time I allowed myself to abandon the illusion of perfection. Monica nodded in silence, and her squeeze on my hand was the answer I needed. It wasn't full forgiveness, it wasn't total reconciliation, but it was a path. And that path, for me, was worth more than any banquet or embroidery. The clock struck 8, and I realized that we had spent the entire day there, between tears, anger, and confessions. A Sunday that would never be forgotten, not for the lost food, but for the life that was beginning to be mended. When she finally let go of my hand, I realized that a weight had been lifted from me, but another one still remained, the responsibility of truly changing. That moment of partial reconciliation was not enough. I knew I would have to prove, day after day, that I was capable of listening to her without hiding behind the pans or the embroidery. I got up slowly, picked up the dish towel from the floor, and folded it carefully. It was not just a practical gesture. It was a way of telling myself that I was willing to pick up the pieces, even the smallest ones. Monica wiped her face with the back of her hand, took a deep breath, and said in a low voice, "I don't know if I can forget everything, but maybe I can start to forgive." Those words were like a breath of hope. I didn't expect absolution. I didn't expect the hurt to suddenly disappear. Just hearing that there was room for a beginning was more than I dared to ask for. Robert, sitting next to us, smiled discreetly, like someone who was finally seeing a point of light after so much weight. I then decided to take a concrete action. I walked to the kitchen cabinet, took one of my oldest preserves, a jar of pickled peppers, my grandmother's recipe, and placed it on the table. This jar is the most valuable thing I have, because it carries the memory of our family. But if it is a symbol of my silence, I can give it up. What I don't want to give up is you. My voice came out firm, and my hands didn't tremble. It was my way of showing that I was willing to change, even to renounce what defined me. Monica looked at the jar, then at me, and shook her head with silent tears. "You don't have to give up anything, Mom. I just need you to be here, whole without hiding." Her tone was no longer accusatory, but vulnerable. I felt there was an invitation there, the invitation to rebuild, to be truly present. I extended my hand again, and she held it more firmly this time. Robert sighed, relieved, like someone who was watching the storm finally begin to dissipate. The night was already falling, and the kitchen was now lit only by the yellowish lamp above the table. The smell of burning still permeated the air, but curiously, it no longer seemed unbearable. Maybe because, in the midst of the bitterness, something new had been born. "I will make mistakes again, Monica," I confessed, "because there is no such thing as a perfect mother. But if you give me the chance, I want to learn to be the mother you need, and not the one I imagined." It was the first time I allowed myself to abandon the illusion of perfection. Monica nodded in silence, and her squeeze on my hand was the answer I needed. It wasn't full forgiveness. It wasn't total reconciliation, but it was a path. And that path, for me, was worth more than any banquet or embroidery. The clock struck 8, and I realized that we had spent the entire day there, between tears, anger, and confessions. A Sunday that would never be forgotten. Not for the lost food, but for the life that was beginning to be mended. When she finally let go of Monica's hand, I realized that a weight had been lifted from me, but another one still remained. The responsibility to truly change. That moment of partial reconciliation was not enough. I knew I would need to prove, day after day, that I was capable of listening to her without hiding behind the pans or the embroidery. I got up slowly, picked up the dish towel from the floor, and folded it carefully. It was not just a practical gesture. It was a way of telling myself that I was willing to pick up the pieces, even the smallest ones. Monica wiped her face with the back of her hand, took a deep breath, and said in a low voice, "I don't know if I can forget everything, but maybe I can start to forgive." Those words were like a breath of hope. I didn't expect absolution. I didn't expect the hurt to suddenly disappear. Just hearing that there was room for a beginning was more than I dared to ask for. Robert, sitting next to us, smiled discreetly, like someone who was finally seeing a point of light after so much weight. I then decided to take a concrete action. I walked to the kitchen cabinet, took one of my oldest preserves, a jar of pickled peppers, my grandmother's recipe, and placed it on the table. This jar is the most valuable thing I have, because it carries the memory of our family. But if it is a symbol of my silence, I can give it up. What I don't want to give up is you. My voice came out firm, and my hands didn't tremble. It was my way of showing that I was willing to change, even to renounce what defined me. Monica looked at the jar, then at me, and shook her head with silent tears. "You don't have to give up anything, Mom. I just need you to be here, whole, without hiding." Her tone was no longer accusatory, but vulnerable. I felt there was an invitation there, the invitation to rebuild, to be truly present. I extended my hand again, and she held it more firmly this time. Robert sighed, relieved, like someone who was watching the storm finally begin to dissipate. The night was already falling, and the kitchen was now lit only by the yellowish lamp above the table. The smell of burning still permeated the air, but, curiously, it no longer seemed unbearable. Maybe because, in the midst of the bitterness, something new had been born. "I will make mistakes again, Monica," I confessed, "because there is no such thing as a perfect mother. But if you give me the chance, I want to learn to be the mother you need, and not the one I imagined." It was the first time I allowed myself to abandon the illusion of perfection. Monica nodded in silence, and her squeeze on. My hand was the answer I needed. It wasn't full forgiveness, it wasn't total reconciliation, but it was a path. And that path, for me, was worth more than any banquet or embroidery. The clock struck 8, and I realized that we had spent the entire day there, between tears, anger, and confessions. A Sunday that would never be forgotten, not for the lost food, but for the life that was beginning to be mended. When the door closed behind them, I sat down at the table again, alone, and looked at the still intact jar of peppers. I smiled through tears, because I realized that I didn't need to break it to prove anything. What I needed to break were the silences that pushed us apart. And that night, I made a decision. From then on, every meal, every conversation, would no longer be a disguise, but a bridge. I didn't know how long it would take, but I was ready to start. Sometimes, the wounds that hurt the most are not the ones that time leaves, but the ones that are stored in the silence, between people who love each other. If you got this far with me, maybe you also carry memories of words that were never said, or gestures that were not understood. Tell me in the comments, have you ever lived through something similar? Or have you ever felt that someone very close didn't see your pain? Sometimes sharing these experiences is the first step to relieving a burden that seemed to be only yours. If this story made you think of someone, maybe it's worth sending the video to that person. Who knows? Maybe it's the start of a conversation that never happened. And if you want to follow more stories like this, stay with me here. Every story can be a mirror or a bridge, and maybe the next one will be yours.